Good evening and welcome to ILTV's Israel Weekly. I'm Aaron Porras, and with me today to discuss the latest diplomatic and political developments are former Deputy Foreign Minister, Knesset member and Ambassador to the United States, Dani Ayalon, and Dr. Martin Sherman, who is the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you both for joining me tonight. Tonight we'll be talking about voting, and though for various reasons there's been a lot of talk about pushing for early elections here in Israel, it's on our neighbors that I want to focus tonight. There were two big election moves over the last week or two that got the whole world in a stir. Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, despite the advice of Ayatollah Khamenei, has put his name in the running for president again against incumbent Hassan Rouhani. And Turkey just voted earlier this week to effectively make Turkish President Erdogan their new dictator. But first, I want to turn to an arguably more pressing vote, or rather the lack thereof, of a UN vote regarding the recent incidents in Syria. At the start of this month, there was a horrifying sarin gas attack, resulting in roughly 90 dead, 31 of them children. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad claims that at best he isn't responsible, and at worst it was fabricated to justify United States missile strikes on regime air bases. He goes on to reaffirm that he couldn't possibly have been responsible since he complied with an international demand to disarm his chemical weapons arsenal in 2013. This claim was swiftly refuted in an interview by The Telegraph with former Syrian General Zaher al-Zakat, who served as a Syrian division head of chemical warfare before defecting from Syria in 2013. He said, quote, "The regime turned over 1,300 tons of chemical weapons, but in reality it possesses twice that amount. The total amount was at least 2,000 tons, of which several hundred tons were sarin gas," end quote. As it stands, most of the international community, including the United States, is seemingly convinced that the Syrian president is responsible for the attack and should be deposed. But at the United Nations, Syrian ally Russia used its veto power to shut down a potential investigation.
On the issue of the chemical attack, British scientists have analysed material from the site of the attack. They're very clear that sarin or a sarin-like substance was used. And as our ambassador to the United Nations made clear yesterday, like the United States, we believe it is highly likely that attack was carried out by the Assad regime. Apart from anything else, we believe it's only the regime that has the capability to take such an attack and make such an attack.
We do think it's important that Assad's departure is done in an orderly way, so that certain interests and constituencies that he represents feel they have been represented at the negotiating table for a political solution. How that occurs, we leave that to the process going forward. We do not think one has to occur before the other can begin, and it will take a pace of its own. But the final outcome, in our view, does not provide for a role for Assad or for the Assad family in the future governance of Syria.
Ambassador, I'd like to start with you. Based on this language, it really does sound like the international community is planning to oust Assad. What is the likelihood of something like that happening?
Well, this has not changed. This has always been the American position, pretty much the EU position. With Trump, in the beginning, it was unclear. And actually just a few days before the gas attack, there were some talks by the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley of the United States and others, that this is not a top priority, not Assad. But I guess after this sarin and the chemical weapon attack, I don't think that there is any question about a very, very hard position. The G7, as the British you may have heard here, did not reach a consensus, mostly because of the German. But I believe at the end of the day, there will have to be a solution without Assad, because the Russians, at the end of the day, will also understand. I mean, the Russians' interest is not personally on Assad. The Russians' interest is on the Alawites as a group, and basically to keep or carve out a strip of land for them, which where the Alawites are, Damascus, and the coastal line, of course, with Tartus and Latakia. And once this is agreed, mainly between Putin and Trump, then I think Assad will be gone.
Dr. Sherman, turning to you for another follow-up hypothetical, if we were to oust Assad, what are the risks involved for Israel?
Well, that's basically is the problematics with Syria. It's very difficult to envision a good outcome. But I think this episode has sort of highlighted two things. One, the impotence of the international community, and on the other hand, the hypocrisy of the international community. Because apart from the methods used in the attack in northern Syria, there was nothing really remarkable about it.
Right.
Only less than 100 people apparently died, which is a small percentage of the almost 500,000 people who've been killed by all sorts of other brutal means, whether it's being beheaded, dismembered, lynched, etc., etc. So the problem is far greater. This may be a catalyst, as Ambassador Ayalon said before, to try and galvanize the international community to get rid of Assad. But I think there's a huge question mark after that. And I think for Israel, there's an important lesson here. Imagine what would have happened if Israel had listened to the Land for Peace advocates and evacuated the Golan Heights. Then there would have been no good outcomes. Because if Assad had lost, you would have had Sunni extremists deploying in the Golan overlooking Tiberias and the Galilee. And if Assad won, you'd have Shiite, Hezbollah, and maybe even Iranian Revolutionary Guards deployed overlooking the Tiberias and the Galilee. So I think from an Israeli point of view, it's very, very important to internalize that outcome, or that possible outcome, and remember that danger when contemplating further Land for Peace concessions.
All right. Now, with respect to Russia, Ambassador, you once told me that Russia is protecting its interests just to, support Syria. It's protecting its interest in protecting Syria. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you if, obviously that explains why they vetoed the United Nations vote, but if a country's leader, like Assad, clearly has broken, the bounds of international law, a document that he signed at the UN, is that not grounds for action from the UN despite Russia's veto?
Oh, absolutely. And I would add to that the recent discovery or a renegade intelligence officer from the Assad army who actually testified or said that Assad has many, many more tons of this chemical.
I believe I quoted him, Mr. Zakat.
I would say, again, the UN Security Council goes back to the same pattern of the Cold War, where the US and Russia neutralize each other, rendering it useless. And that goes back to the entire international community, which, as Dr. Sherman said, not only it's impotent, not only hypocritical, it's very cynical. If they do anything, it's too little and too late. And certainly, Israel's lesson is never rely on international community, always be in a position that we can defend ourselves by ourselves.
Yeah, I think
I strongly endorse that message.
I think that that's a message that we can see from historically Israel is following very strictly at the moment.
Oh, I would hope so.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn now to former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who's running for re-election next month in Iran. He still needs to be confirmed by the Iranian Guardian Council, but he submitted the necessary candidacy paperwork last week, despite being publicly advised against it by Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Ahmadinejad said after submitting his paperwork that he was only there to support his former vice president, Hamid Bagawi. He was there to support Bagawi in his running for president. He did not, however, elaborate on how competing with Bagawi was helping him. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei told Ahmadinejad not to run anymore because his already divisive history might split the country further. After he won re-election in 2009, for example, an 8-month protest erupted on suspicions that the election was rigged. He also became the thorn in the side of the West for his threatening rhetoric and actions. Let's take a look at some of his greatest hits.
همونطوری که اتحاد جماهیر شوروی محو شد و امروز در عالم چیزی به نام اتحاد جماهیر شوروی وجود ندارد، به زودی رژیم صهیونیستی هم محو خواهد شد و بشر آزاد خواهد شد.
ما در ایران اولا همجنسباز مثل کشور شما نداریم. در کشور ما چنین چیزی وجود ندارد.
اما ملت ایران بهانه تراشی، صحنه سازی، داستان پردازی، مقدمه سازی برای نسل کشی ملت فلسطین رو هم محکوم می‌کند.
Dr. Sherman, I'm going to start with you this time. What do you make of Ahmadinejad's bid for president, and how do you think Israel is preparing for another Iran under Ahmadinejad, if at all?
Well, I think for Israel, the outcome of the elections in Iran is more or less a competition between shades of black. I don't think it would make an enormous difference who would be elected. In fact, they say that one of the candidates, a fellow by the name of Ibrahim Raisi, is far worse than Ahmadinejad, and he apparently has a good chance, judging from current surveys. So I'm not sure that this is a huge issue for Israel. I think Israel, no matter who takes over Iran, has to adopt a very firm position of posture of deterrence and plan for the worst, no matter who wins the elections. We were talking before the broadcast, and the point came up that perhaps having Ahmadinejad in power is probably a good thing for Israel, because it sort of tears the mask off of the pseudo-moderate image that Rouhani has at the moment.
So we know where he stands,
yeah.
at least.
But I think in general, as I said before, for us, the election, there's shades of black. And I think it focuses the attention on the folly of the nuclear agreement with Iran, because with Rouhani there was some sort of pretext that we now have a moderate figure to deal with. If someone more extreme would come through, I think this would certainly highlight the folly of that agreement.
Well, that actually brings me right into my next question, is that both Rouhani and Ahmadinejad have voiced some support in theory for the deal as they understand it. But in practice, under Rouhani, Iran has already violated the terms of the agreement multiple times. And Ahmadinejad, we really have no idea how he would behave beyond his rhetoric. So what do you think it will happen to the Iranian nuclear deal, JCPOA deal?
Oh, I believe the
later?
Iranians, under any president, would do their utmost to keep this agreement valid, because it works for them. What did this deal do? It actually kept their capabilities. It did not demolish the capabilities, just put it on hold, basically, and it's pretty much up to the goodwill of the Iranians whether to comply. And we know that they do not have a goodwill. So as far as whoever wins, they will do everything to keep this agreement alive. I do hope that under the leadership of Trump, not only they will hold the international community, or the P5+1 that really signed the agreement, not only that they would hold the Iranians' feet to the fire to make sure that they adhere to this agreement, to the letter and to the spirit, but also that they would extend it over to the terror that Iran is doing, and the testing of ballistic missiles.
Which I want to get back to their state sponsorship of terror in a minute, but I'd like to follow up with, would Israel reconsider a military action against their nuclear sites like that we've done in the past?
Well, I would say that nothing should be, off the table, and certainly we have the right to for self-defense, and once there is a real, clear, and present danger, then we should be free, and we are free to do as we deem right to make sure that we continue to live here.
Dr. Sharon?
Well, picking up on what Ambassador Ayalon said, the agreement basically ensures Iran's ability to weaponize its nuclear capability and does not prevent them from developing the means to deliver it.
Right.
Now, I believe that the only way that Iran can be forced to give up its nuclear ambitions is by to confront it with a credible military threat. Now, I don't know whether there is a political resolve in the United States to do that because of the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan. But sadly, I think that that's the only way to get the Iranians to back off and to give up their ambitions for a nuclearized weapons capability. And I'm very pessimistic. I think the world has a lot to worry about.
I was going to say, what is the likelihood that, realistically, that we could pull off a military strike in enemy territory such as Iran? Up until Donald Trump was in the White House, there were even threats to shoot down Israeli planes. America was threatening to shoot down Israeli planes should we try. So, how do you see that working under Trump?
Well, okay, go ahead.
Well, planes are not the only equipment that Israel has to destroy installations in Iran. But I think the problem here is far more American resolve than Israeli resolve. And I think that's the big problem, because it's a very, very difficult decision to convince the Iranians that they are facing a credible threat. Because up until now, everything that we've seen is that the Iranians can dismiss threats as being not credible. If you remember, before the negotiations, the slogan was, no deal is better than a bad deal. And then to justify that deal, they said it's a bad deal, but it's the best we could get. So the Iranians have every reason to believe that they will not be confronted, at least from America and from the West, by some credible threat. And, you know, as far as what Israel can do, I'm sure this is all highly classified, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Israel has far more destructive capability than people think it has.
I just want to really quickly touch on this last question, is that, again, we said that the Iranian regime is responsible for the world's state sponsorship of terror, you know, the world's biggest state sponsor of terror. What do you think? Do you think we'll see any sort of change under Ahmadinejad than we have under Rouhani? I mean, Rouhani was the recipient of several $100 billion after the JCPOA deal was signed, but you know that money is still sitting somewhere. It hasn't all been spent, I'm sure.
The only difference between Rouhani and Ahmadinejad is a mask. That Rouhani wears supposedly a mask of moderation, but there is no difference whatsoever in the ideology, in the purpose, in everything else. The only effective or the most effective way to neutralize Iran on all these fronts, the terror sponsorship, the missile testing, and of course the nuclear capabilities, is by cooperation between Trump and Putin. Now, I could see such a cooperation on the merit of a mutual or beneficial interests. And for instance, if Assad or if Putin gets his way in Russia with or without Assad, then I think his motivation to support Iran goes down. Right. If you add to that the Ukraine, and let's say that the Americans tell the Russians that pretty much they're not going to push them on the Ukraine or not on the NATO issue with the Baltic and other positioning of missiles in Czech Republic or Poland, right, then I think it will be very easy for them to give up Iran and to gain Ukraine and this peripheral area in Europe, Eastern Europe.
Interesting. All right, well, let's move on to our final topic. Our final topic tonight focuses on Turkey. Earlier this week, the Turkish people voted on whether or not to replace Turkey's parliamentary system with an all-powerful executive presidency. The referendum passed with just 50.5% of the vote, essentially imbuing President Tayyip Erdogan with new dictator-like powers. As you can imagine, the vote itself and especially its outcome is highly controversial.
Bugün yapılan anayasa değişikliği halk oylamasının sonuçlarının ülkemiz ve milletimiz için hayırlı olmasını diliyorum. Milletimiz bir kez daha gerçekten çok müstesna, farklı bir olgunluk içerisinde sandık başına gitmiş, hür iradesiyle Türkiye Büyük Millet Meclisi tarafından kabul edilen anayasa değişikliği konusundaki görüşünü ifade etmiştir. İşimiz çok, yapacağımız çok şey var bu ülkede. İnşallah ilk iş
Well, the fact that the results are so close, we can see that a very much divided nation. This is one of the most important referendums ever in Turkey's history about the future of this country, how this country will be ruled. But the result we have today shows that there is no clear mind on this very key decision.
Ben çok yeterli olacağını düşünmüyorum çünkü referandum sonucundan ortaya çıkan sayısal sonuç %50 yani yarı yarıya ve bu şu demektir yani toplumun çok geneli bu referandumu kabul etmedi çok açık.
Yeni sistem hani bilmiyorum neler getirecek ama mutluyum yani sonuçta benim desteklediğim kişi başkan oldu. Bununla ilgili mutluyum. Yeni sistem inşallah hayırlı olur. Hani ne getirecek gerçekten bilmiyorum.
So let's answer the lady's question. What will Erdogan's new powers bring? Sure.
Nothing good. Nothing good. Nothing good, but I think what you're seeing here is a vivid illustration of the formidable force that Erdogan is. because it was just over 15 years ago that he was in prison and banned from politics. And since then, he's done basically incredible things, like defanged the Turkish army, reduced their political role in keeping the country secular, and has taken over. Together with that, Turkey is facing huge problems, a demographic problem with the Kurds, predicted to be soon almost a majority. And I think he's going to face increasing internal problems, which is going to make him even more dangerous and more dangerous for Israel, which, if I just may mention, the rapprochement agreement with Turkey, giving Turkey a special status in Gaza, I think that is going to prove a terrible folly, especially in the light of what's happening here, because if Turkish personnel or Turkish forces in Gaza are involved in any clashes with the IDF, I think we could see a rapid deterioration of the situation.
Do you think, well, first of all, how would you like to respond to that?
Well, I agree. I think what we see with Erdogan is taking it back to the Sultanate period. I think also it is very clear that this is the ultimate writing off of Europe. That means Erdogan is just telling the Europeans, forget about me, and he is banking his future on alliances with countries like Russia, Putin, and Iran.
Well, he's already threatened the EU with allowing, massive migration of migrants from Syria.
And I think the Europeans have a major dilemma here, because Turkey is still a NATO member. And I think that is really calling for some consideration and review by the European countries.
Which is becoming more absurd every day, isn't it? NATO membership.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm sure I don't typically like, questions that are so speculative, but do you think that there's merit to the idea that the election was rigged?
I certainly think it's not implausible.
Right.
I don't have enough information, but there seems to be a lot of internal resistance to it, so I would say it's probably not implausible, but it doesn't make much difference, I think, at this stage. I don't think that there's much chance of it being overturned. And I think Israel has to watch the situation very carefully, because as internal friction inside Turkey increases, I think they will try and deflect public attention to external enemies, and what better than the Zionist entity?
Yeah, but I would just add that here, I think that the relations will not be rocky so long as the interests of Turkey are being served. As far as energy goes, energy supply, to diversify their sources, as far as opening or at least keeping a route to the products, Turkish products, to the Arab world, which is done through us and not through Syria anymore for obvious reasons. I believe they will keep this relationship very steady, and they're gaining from it quite a bit.
So just final quick thoughts. How should the world, Israel included in that, how should the world be reacting to this?
Well, the world hasn't got much wriggle room here, because Erdogan's winning card is the refugees. And if he releases a wave of refugees into Europe, that's going to be catastrophic. So I think that we don't have many immediate good options, rather than protesting and keeping up pressure and trying to block off certain actions. But as I said before, Erdogan has proved himself a formidable force in the last 15 years and has achieved almost unthinkable demands. I mean, if you think of Turkey in the late 1990s, to think of Turkey today would have seemed impossible, with the army in control of the country, protecting civil society and the secular nature of the country. No one would have ever imagined that the country would have reached where it's reached now. And so I think Erdogan is someone who must be treated with great respect, because I think he's a force for great harm for the West.
As well, just as much as Putin is. And the international community, unfortunately, has much bigger fish to fry. Assad, Iran, so they cannot handle too many fronts, and certainly they are going to leave Erdogan alone at this moment.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for this edition of ILTV's Israel Weekly. Thanks again to our guests, Dani Ayalon and Dr. Martin Sherman, and thank you all for watching and tuning in. See you next week, and shalom from Israel.